For the first time since his father's cancer diagnosis, Prince William is back to work and addressing his family's health scares.
We really appreciate everyone's kind messages.
The world thought they'd seen it all when Queen Elizabeth passed. But now, the palace whispers another goodbye is coming, one no one was ready for. The sense of stability she embodied has begun to fracture again, this time under the heavy shadow of her son's diagnosis. Britain, still grappling with the grief of one monarch's passing, is forced to confront the possibility of another farewell looming far too soon. When Queen Elizabeth left the world, it was after 7 decades of service, her farewell expected, dignified, and final. But this feels different. It feels rushed, cruel, as if history is repeating itself before the wounds of yesterday have even begun to heal. The revelation of King Charles's illness struck the nation like thunder on a clear day. There were no warnings, no slow build-up, no gentle transition. Instead, whispers became headlines almost overnight. The king had been diagnosed with what insiders called a life-altering, incurable condition. It wasn't just a medical crisis, it was the kind of truth that made hearts sink and minds question everything. For a man who waited longer than any heir in history, wearing the crown seemed more a curse than a blessing now. And yet, even as rumors swirled and speculation grew, the palace itself remained silent, refusing to satisfy the public's hunger for answers. But silence speaks volumes, and every absence, every cancelled event, only made the whispers louder. The weight of his diagnosis wasn't just measured in doctors' reports, it was carried in every decision he made in those quiet early days. He began fading from public view, his appearances less frequent, his presence more ghostly than regal. Royal calendars, once crowded with engagements, now bore blank spaces. Official statements cited rest, recovery, reflection, but few believed them. And through it all, an air of dread settled over the nation, thick and inescapable. People began to look at photographs differently, scrutinizing his face for signs of fragility, searching for proof of resilience where there was none. Then came the letter, a single sheet of paper that changed everything. Not a royal proclamation, not a speech delivered to cameras, but a private, handwritten letter from father to son. It was addressed simply, William. Inside, the words were as heavy as the crown itself. It's your turn now. Those 4 words told a story more devastating than any press release ever could. They weren't just an acknowledgement of the inevitable. They were a quiet confession of defeat. A man who spent decades preparing for this role, who endured mockery, scandals, and endless waiting, was now telling his son to prepare to take it from him. But William wasn't the only one carrying this burden. The whole nation felt it too, the unsettling knowledge that the man who finally became king was already preparing to step aside, perhaps before anyone could truly call him their monarch. The collective memory of Queen Elizabeth's death still lingers in Britain's streets, in its homes, in the hearts of its people. Black ribbons, tearful tributes, hushed radio broadcasts, they haven't faded yet. And now, that same grief threatens to awaken again, clawing at a country already weary from loss. Only this time, it feels messier, more uncertain, more unfair. People began to ask questions no one could answer. How much time does he really have? Will he even have the chance to leave his mark before the illness claims him? And most chilling of all, what if this reign, one that took a lifetime to begin, ends before it truly starts? And behind the palace walls, the first clues of a farewell began not with a speech, but with a letter that changed everything. It wasn't a royal decree, but 2 quiet letters that set the monarchy on edge, and no one knows exactly what one of them said. In the stillness of the palace, as whispers of King Charles's failing health swirled like a storm outside, he took pen to paper, and began what many now see as his final act of control. The first letter, addressed to his eldest son, William, was chilling in its simplicity, yet devastating in its weight. Those 4 words, "It's your turn now," were not just instructions, but an inheritance. The crown, heavy and unyielding, was no longer just a symbol of his own ambition. It became a burden he was handing over to his son before time forced it from his grasp. In that moment, Charles was no longer the king preparing for a future he once dreamed of. He became a man confronting the cruel reality that his reign might already be over. Yet what followed next was even more unsettling. A second letter, written just as deliberately, but shrouded in even deeper mystery, was addressed to Harry. Marked private and delivered through secure diplomatic channels, it arrived in Montecito without fanfare, yet with all the gravity of a final confession. Unlike William's letter, its contents remain unknown, locked away between father and son. But those close to the family say it was not a letter of blame or bitterness. Instead, it carried a gesture of peace, a fragile olive branch extended at the edge of mortality. Even after years of silence, estrangement, and public conflict, Charles reached out, as if to say what politics and pride had kept him from saying for so long: "You are still my son." The emotional tone of these letters sent shockwaves through the palace corridors. Seasoned aides accustomed to the king's formality and calculation found themselves unnerved by the raw finality of his words. This was not the Charles they knew, who always measured each phrase, who buried sentiment beneath centuries of tradition. Instead, they saw a man resolute to say goodbye properly, even if doing so meant cracking the facade of royal stoicism and exposing his heart in ink. Some staff whispered that this was the moment they truly understood the gravity of his condition. Not the hospital visits, not the cancelled engagements, but the letters. Because writing them meant he knew the end was no longer some distant possibility. It was approaching. Palace aides couldn't help but wonder if the king was trying to put things right in ways no ceremony or protocol ever could. Whether it was guilt, love, or simply the inevitability of time that pushed him to write, no one could say. But everyone felt the unspoken acknowledgement that these weren't just words. They were goodbyes dressed as guidance. And though the nation would never read them, their impact was unmistakable. The monarchy itself seemed to tremble under their weight, as if the very institution knew something was ending before its people did. But even as words were written in private, actions in public began to speak volumes. What began as whispers became sirens when Charles was rushed to hospital, and the palace's silence only fueled the storm. For days, the press had been circling, sniffing at gaps in the royal schedule, tracking cancellations that no one dared explain. But when the sound of ambulances pierced the morning quiet, everything changed. What the palace called a temporary reaction was anything but ordinary. The king, frail and withdrawn, was hurried through private corridors and into the care of doctors. And though official statements promised reassurance, the nation didn't believe a word of it. It was clear from the speed, the secrecy, the solemn faces of aides, who usually wore nothing but polite detachment, that something serious was unfolding. The media's response was immediate and relentless. Skepticism seeped into headlines that once tiptoed around royal affairs. Broadcasters scrambled to decode vague updates from Buckingham Palace, their anchors' voices heavy with suspicion. A temporary reaction? Or the collapse of a king? They asked aloud. The BBC aired clips of his last public speech, slowing down the footage to point out his trembling hands, his hollow cheeks. Papers that normally lauded royal resilience began hinting that this might be the final chapter already written, just waiting to be read. "We've seen this play before," murmured one senior correspondent, the words chilling everyone who remembered Queen Elizabeth's last weeks. Silence, then sadness. Behind the gilded gates, cancellations stacked one atop the other. High-profile engagements vanished from the royal website overnight. A much-anticipated meeting with foreign dignitaries was indefinitely postponed without explanation. The planned unveiling of an initiative dear to the king's heart was erased entirely, replaced with a blunt announcement. On advice of doctors, His Majesty will rest. But nobody believed the narrative of rest anymore. Not when his calendar cleared so completely, so suddenly, leaving nothing but empty days where there should have been ceremony. For many Britons, the familiar rhythm of events being quietly cancelled felt hauntingly familiar. They'd seen it with Elizabeth, the tightening of information, the odd smiles masking worry, the sudden hush of an entire institution bracing for an inevitable fall. Back then, the kingdom mourned its matriarch with black ribbons and candlelit vigils. Now, they watched as history threatened to repeat itself, this time faster, sharper, and crueler. And though the palace clung desperately to its language of recovery and resilience, the country began to murmur what nobody dared say outright: that this wasn't just a complication. That this was, in fact, the beginning of the end. The king's shadow was lengthening, his presence dimming, and the silence coming from Buckingham felt less like discretion and more like quiet dread. Yet while the palace stayed silent, one controversial voice decided to break the quiet and reveal what no one else dared to say. When Lady Colin spoke, the world listened, and many wished they hadn't. In the uneasy quiet after King Charles's hospital dash, her words cut through the fog like a blade, cold and impossible to ignore. Speaking on a podcast with her characteristic bluntness, she delivered what no palace official dared to say: "There is no strong hope of a cure." Those 6 words sent shockwaves through Britain, rippling across television screens and dominating headlines. Some gasped in disbelief, others nodded in grim recognition. And in that moment, silence was no longer an option. Her authority came not just from audacity, but from access. For decades, Lady Colin had mingled effortlessly within aristocratic circles, her connections winding deep into the private lives of the royal family. She claimed to have spoken to those who would know, people who had seen the king up close, spoken to his doctors, witnessed the struggle he tried to hide. Unlike the carefully worded palace statements, her words carried no polish, no comfort, just unvarnished truth. Or so it seemed. Yet, even as her revelation rattled the nation, the public reaction split sharply in two. Some branded her a fearmonger, accusing her of exploiting a delicate moment for notoriety. But others insisted she was simply voicing what everyone already suspected, saying aloud, the truth the palace was too cowardly to admit. The debate raged, not just in newsrooms, but in homes, pubs, and online. Everywhere people gathered to try to make sense of what was happening to their king. Social media, as always, threw fuel on the fire. Clips of Lady Colin's statements circulated furiously. Hashtags like #King Charles Health Crisis and #No Hope trending within hours. Every frame of his latest appearances was dissected, scrutinized, and shared in slow motion. And what viewers saw was hard to ignore. In his final engagements before retreating from the public eye, Charles had looked alarmingly diminished, his figure thinner, his hands shaking, his speeches punctuated by labored breaths and long, unsettling pauses. The man who once strode confidently into rooms now faltered, visibly fighting to maintain the image of command even as his body betrayed him. The more people saw, the harder it became to believe the palace's reassurances. Lady Colin's chilling claim clung to every new image, making it impossible to see the king without also seeing the shadow of his mortality. Her words, intended or not, had shifted the conversation forever. No longer was this about a temporary setback. Now, it was a reckoning with a brutal possibility, one that even his closest allies could no longer fully dismiss. And behind every appearance, the weight of the crown was beginning to crush the man who had waited a lifetime to wear it. For over 70 years, he waited for the crown, but no one told him it might destroy him before he could truly wear it. King Charles's entire life had been spent in the long, suffocating shadow of destiny. Every lesson, every humiliation, every sacrifice had been endured for this singular moment when the weight of history would finally rest on his head. But now that it had, the reality was crueler than anything he could have imagined. His health faltered just as his authority began to solidify, and what should have been the dawn of his reign was already darkened by doubt. Even as his body betrayed him, Charles refused to let go of his constitutional responsibilities. He attended private briefings, reviewed daily paperwork, and insisted on being kept informed of Parliament's deliberations. Those close to him whispered that he was determined to fulfill every duty he could while time still allowed, even if it came at a steep cost. Each day became a balancing act between obligation and survival, each choice framed not by what was right for the monarchy, but what his body would let him endure. His advisors pleaded with him to rest, to let others handle the details. But Charles pushed on stubbornly, clinging to the idea that every decision still mattered, that he was not yet defeated. Doctors began to advise against travel altogether. They warned him quietly but firmly. Another state visit, another long journey could break him. But Charles bristled at their words, refusing to cancel everything outright. When his planned visit to Italy, a symbolic gesture meant to reaffirm Britain's ties to Europe, was postponed indefinitely. The disappointment in his eyes was palpable. The crown demanded presence, and yet his own body was keeping him away from the world. That postponed trip became more than just a missed opportunity. It was a warning that he could no longer move through his reign on his own terms. Behind closed doors, every decision became a cruel trade-off. If he pressed forward, he risked collapse. If he stepped back, he risked being remembered not as a monarch, but as a fleeting figurehead who never truly led. The corridors of the palace carried whispers that grew louder by the day. Would this reign, the one he waited a lifetime to claim, become the shortest in modern royal history? Would the man who bore decades of expectation crumble under its weight before the world even got to know him as king? And as Charles's grip weakened, one man stepped forward not because he wanted to, but because he had to. He never wanted it to happen this way. But William is learning what it means to carry the crown, while still mourning the man who wears it. In the hollow spaces of the palace, where silence now speaks louder than ceremony, William has been called into rooms he never thought he'd enter this soon. Confidential briefings come daily now, quiet meetings where advisors walk him through protocols, contingency plans, and decisions meant only for a king. He listens carefully, taking notes, but his eyes betray the storm beneath. He's not just inheriting a throne, he's inheriting a burden he never asked to carry yet. At first, the changes in him were subtle, but the world noticed. His public appearances have grown more measured, his words more deliberate, his presence more commanding. Commentators no longer speak of him merely as the heir. Increasingly, they call him the acting king. On podiums, he stands straighter, alone more often, answering questions as though the weight of two crowns rests on his shoulders, his father's fading reign and his own reluctant rise. Each speech, each gesture, seems carefully chosen, as though he knows history is already watching. But duty does not wait for anyone to finish grieving, and William is forced to navigate his own quiet heartbreak while the world expects him to stand firm. Behind the scenes, he also watches over his wife, Catherine, as she fights her own health battles. He carries her struggles alongside his father's decline, walking a delicate line between public obligation and private devotion. Those closest to him say he has barely slept in weeks, yet his face never falters. The press and the public alike have begun to notice the change. Articles now speak of his resolve, his somber determination, the heavy shadows in his expression. Social media brims with comparisons to his grandmother Elizabeth in her youth, carrying the crown through wartime and loss. But behind the eyes of a man seen as steady and strong lies something more fragile, a son mourning his father in real time, even as he learns how to replace him. This duality has begun to wear him down. The emotional toll of being both heir and caretaker at once shows in ways no camera can fully capture. Those who know him say his silence has grown longer, his gaze sharper, as though he's memorizing every move his father makes because soon, too soon, those moves will have to be his. He never wanted this, not like this. But now there is no turning back. But even as William prepared to step into the light, Charles's focus turned to the one person everyone thought he'd shut out forever. In the shadow of mortality, old wounds seemed smaller, and a father reached out to his estranged son one last time. Even as his health declined, King Charles found himself haunted less by the throne he might lose, and more by the family he had already lost. In quiet defiance of years of bitterness and silence, he made a choice that no aide or advisor had dared to suggest. With his own hand, he wrote a letter to Harry not as king to prince, not as monarch to renegade, but as father to son. The words came easily this time, unburdened by politics, stripped of formality. This was not a message designed for history. This was a plea for peace, perhaps his final chance to mend what time and pride had broken. Those who witnessed the decision said the air in the room changed when Charles folded the letter and sealed it himself. Palace insiders hardened to royal rituals and long accustomed to his restraint were visibly shaken. For a man who had, for so long, refused to confront the fracture between his sons, this sudden gesture of reconciliation stunned everyone. And yet, as one aide quietly admitted, it felt inevitable, as though the urgency of his condition had stripped away all the reasons not to. Mortality has a way of clarifying what matters most. Delivered through secure channels, the letter arrived in Montecito, marked private, and no one but Harry knows exactly what it said. But whispers suggest it was painfully honest, a confession of love and regret, free of any accusations, free of the weight of royal duty, just a father telling his son that no matter the choices, no matter the distance, he was still his. For now, Harry's response remains a mystery. Palace sources hint that quiet talks have begun behind the scenes, out of sight of the cameras, and far from the noise of the press. No titles, no negotiations, just family. It is not yet clear whether this fragile olive branch will hold, or whether years of hurt can truly be undone. But for the king, the act of reaching out seems to have already brought him some measure of peace. To those who know the royal family's history, the letter feels like a final act of defiance, a man refusing to let the crown or the past dictate his last chapter. Whether Harry chooses to answer or not, the king's decision has shifted something in the family, if only for a moment. In the end, perhaps that was the point to prove that even in the face of history, even at the edge of life, a father's love could still speak louder than the crown. While the family faced their private reckoning, The public's gaze turned sharp and suspicious, demanding the full truth. The streets filled with prayers and suspicion alike as the British people grappled with a monarchy shrouded in mystery. Outside royal residences, candles flickered in quiet vigil, while bouquets of flowers piled higher with each passing hour. Social media became a river of grief and defiance tributes to King Charles's decades of service, mingling with sharp demands for truth. Posts of his speeches, his environmental work, his moments of quiet dignity trended alongside accusations that the palace was hiding the full story. Hashtags like #King Charles Farewell and #Hold On Your Majesty swept across the world, each carrying a bittersweet undertone, reverence laced with doubt. The public's affection was undeniable, yet their faith in the narrative grew more fragile with every unspoken answer. People began to notice what wasn't being said. Why were insiders leaking more details than the palace itself? Why was the royal calendar still clearing, with no explanation beyond vague reassurances? In pubs and living rooms and online forums, the question loomed larger with each day. What is Buckingham Palace hiding? Even Queen Camilla, ever the steadfast figure at Charles's side, became part of the speculation. Her calm composure at charity dinners and official events, her careful smile at cameras, began to look less like courage and more like detachment. Why was she seen attending engagements alone, they asked, while her husband reportedly struggled behind closed doors? For some, her poise felt like the strength of a queen holding the fort in the face of disaster. For others, it felt colder, more calculated, as if she was already preparing for life beyond Charles's reign. And just as the monarchy appeared its most vulnerable, another controversy re-emerged to fracture public opinion further. A short video of the king wishing Muslims a blessed Ramadan resurfaced and ignited a heated debate about his interfaith stance. Critics accused him of forgetting his role as defender of the faith, while others defended him as a modern monarch, striving for inclusion. The argument became more than theological. It became a symbol of his entire reign. Progressive, yet polarizing. Beloved, yet doubted. For the first time in a generation, the nation's mourning felt unsettled, restless, and uneasy. They remembered how they grieved Elizabeth, united and quiet. But this time, grief was laced with questions, vigils shadowed by suspicion, and even those who prayed for Charles to recover couldn't shake the sense that something larger was breaking, something older than any single man. And as the nation stood in quiet mourning, the monarchy's global threads began to unravel, threatening to pull the crown apart. With every passing day, the crown feels heavier, the silence louder, and the end closer than anyone dares to say. Around the world, the ripple of Charles's decline is beginning to test the very foundation of what he was meant to uphold. In Commonwealth capitals from Ottawa to Canberra, quiet debates have become open questions. Leaders speak cautiously but clearly. If Britain cannot keep its own monarchy steady, why should we remain bound to it? In Jamaica, a minister bluntly called the situation the natural moment for change. And in Australia, public support for Republican movements surged overnight. What was once unthinkable, breaking the centuries-old tie to Britain, now feels inevitable. For Charles, this looming fracture cuts deeper than politics. He had hoped his reign would be remembered not just for continuity, but for vision. He wanted to modernize the monarchy, to show the world that it could evolve and endure. Climate action, diversity, inclusion, these were not just slogans to him but his life's quiet mission. Yet now, much of that vision remains unfinished, scattered in draft speeches and half-formed initiatives. Illness has stolen the time he thought he had, and the chance to leave his mark grows fainter with every day he spends out of sight. His dreams for reform, which once seemed bold, now seem like whispers swallowed by history. And while the king fades, William grows. His presence is no longer just symbolic. He attends more engagements, delivers speeches that carry the weight of a sovereign, and moves through the halls of power with the kind of confidence his father never fully commanded. Commentators now refer to him openly as Britain's de facto leader, and even palace insiders speak of his readiness in tones that mix admiration and sorrow. William's face has become the one people look to for reassurance, even as his own grief sharpens behind his eyes. Each appearance, each deliberate word, feels like a rehearsal for the inevitable. Inside Buckingham, the unspoken preparations have already begun. Legal advisors quietly update contingency plans. Senior aides shuffle schedules in ways that hint at a future none of them will name aloud. And though no declaration has been made, everyone can feel that this reign is drawing to its close. The monarchy, so steeped in ceremony, now moves almost invisibly to brace for what comes next. Across Britain, and far beyond its shores, millions wait not just for the announcement they know is coming, but for the answers no one has yet dared to give. What will happen when the curtain finally falls? What will this crown, battered and brilliant, look like in the hands of the next king? The silence grows heavier. The farewell has already begun, because the crown may survive, but it will never look the same again. And as Britain braces for what's next, the final chapter of this reign is being written in silence, but felt by millions. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.